PowerPoint for Chapter 4, Research Design. So first we're going to go over the nomothetic explanation a little bit more in a little bit more detail. We talked about it a little bit, I believe, in the first chapter. So again, nomothetic explanation is the, default that we use in most social science research. The vast majority of research uses this. Our goal is to find a few factors that can account for many of the variations in a given phenomenon. So for example, I'm going to use school crime. So we're not looking at one particular school crime and give all the explanations for why it happened. We want to know what school crime kind of in general looks like. So we could say that school crime happens because there's inadequate supervision, either by teachers or security guards or cameras, etc. Having a negative school climate, if it's not a nice place to be, there tends to be more crime in the schools that do not have a good climate. Delinquent peers, so if there's a lot of delinquent kids, obviously there's going to be more crime in the school. And then a lack of after-school activities. So again, this doesn't explain one particular school crime, but rather it's a few factors that can account for a lot of school crime out there. So now the idiographic explanation, again, we don't use this as much in social science. Maybe if you're doing a case study and looking at one particular event, you would use it. But other than that, we don't use it that often. So the goal, again, is to list all the reasons that one particular event or phenomenon took place. So example, why was I late this morning? Well, my dog took forever to pee. There's a long line at Starbucks, construction on the road, couldn't find a parking spot. So that all, accounts for why I was late to work this morning in one particular event, not why everyone's late in general. Okay, so if we were going to look at an idiographic approach for the legalization of marijuana, we might use information from individual parents, teachers, clergy, maybe previous experiences. Whereas a nomothetic approach, maybe we just, instead of looking at why one particular person accepts the legalization of marijuana, we might just, boil it down to one factor, and that might be, political orientation, because it's found that, conservatives generally do not support legalization, while liberals generally do. Again, it doesn't account for all the differences, but if we wanted to sort of pick one factor that might explain why people accept marijuana, we might look at political orientation. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the criteria for nomothetic causality. Again, not all research is causal in nature. Most of our social science research is not causal. Your projects that you're going to be doing, you're not going to be establishing any sort of causal relationships, more, a correlation. So there's several criteria that we must meet before we can say we have a causal relationship. Again, most of our social science research isn't causal, and that's fine. But if we want to say that one thing causes the other, there's definitely things that need to be there. So the first is that the variables must be correlated. Correlated means that there is a relationship between two variables. So when one increases, the other one increases, or when one increases, the other one decreases. So here we have these little pictures. The first one here on the left, height and weight, has a positive correlation. So generally, the taller people are, the more that they weigh. Hours of sleep and tiredness tend to have a negative correlation. So those who sleep longer are less tired. But if we would say, let's look at the correlation between hours of sleep and shoe size. Well, there's no relationship there, right? It doesn't matter, your shoe size will not determine the number of sleep you get, or the amount of sleep you get will not determine your shoe size. So we'd say there's no correlation there. There would not be a causal relationship between those two variables. Okay. So the second criteria for nomothetic causality is time ordering. So the cause or the independent variable has to take place before the effect or the dependent variable. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about longitudinal research, but the easiest way to do this when we're doing research is to, make a measurement of the independent variable, wait a little bit, and then make a measurement of the dependent variable. And this ensures that these are time ordered correctly. We also need to make sure that the variables are non-spurious. So a spurious relationship is a coincidental statistical correlation between two variables shown to be caused by some third variable. So basically, you might think that there's a relationship between two variables, but in reality, it's sort of a third secret variable that's sort of driving that relationship between the two of them. Okay, so again, finding an empirical relationship between two variables does not necessarily establish a causal relationship. Sometimes a correlation is, the result of other relationships, other variables. So here is one on the left-hand side here, one example of a spurious relationship. So we might say that there's a correlation between shoe size and math skills. So the greater somebody's shoe size is, the better math skills they have, and vice versa. So if you have a smaller shoe size, you have worse math skills. So, if you really think about this, shoe size and math skills really aren't related to each other at all. Even if there appears to be a relationship there, there's probably another sort of secret variable that is influencing both of them. So here we could say that that spurious variable is age. So people that are, especially if we're looking at kids, older kids tend to have better math skills. They also tend to have bigger shoe sizes than younger kids. And that age is what, is driving that there. That it looks like there's a relationship, but there really is not. It's really age that's driving this whole thing. Okay, so this is one of my favorite examples of a spurious relationship. So there is a correlation between ice cream sales and crime. So when there's more ice cream sold, there's also more crime, specifically violent crime. You might think, well, that doesn't make sense. What does ice cream have to do with crime? Well, there's, a secret third variable here that's really driving this. And that would be the time of year. So summertime. Summertime, we're selling more ice cream than in the wintertime. Summertime, there's also tends to be more crime. So people are out and about doing things, going on vacations, going to music festivals, this and that, having fun, school's out, they're drinking more. So there tends to be more crime in the summer than in the winter when people are, in their houses. So we could say here that the time of year or the summertime is that third or spurious variable that's really driving that relationship or making it appear that there's a relationship between ice cream sales and crime. Okay, so those are the three criteria. That's definitely going to be something that is going to be on a test. So make sure you understand that. Another thing that we do when we're using, causal analysis and nomothetic explanation is hypothesis testing. So this is going to be something that if you're going to be doing one of these projects, you're probably not going to have a causal relationship there, but you might be, collecting quantitative data and choose to have hypotheses. So to test a hypothesis, you want to specify the variables that you think are related. You want to specify the measurement of those variables. So how are we measuring the variable of crime? Is it arrest for violent crime? Is it self-reported, property crimes? You really have to state exactly what you're measuring there. And you want to just, hypothesize, meaning, now, I wouldn't say guess. Hypothesize is based on prior research, so you would sort of estimate what's going to happen. So you want to say the correlation, is it a positive or negative correlation? The strength of the relationship, do you think there's going to be a large effect there, a small effect there? Statistical significance. If you think there is a relationship, that's going to be statistically significant. But if you say, there's not going to be a relationship, then that would be not statistically significant. And you also want to specify tests for spuriousness. So if you're going to be doing a quantitative project for this class, you're going to want to say what spurious variables might be influencing this. So what other explanations are there that maybe you don't need to measure them for this project, but you just want to say, what could actually be causing this, supposed relationship between these two variables. Okay, so there's some things that are not criteria for nomothetic causality. So these are things that you don't need. First, you don't need complete causation. So there's never one thing influencing, at least in social science, influencing an outcome. There's a multitude of different things. There's a huge variety of different, if we're looking at things like poverty, crime, abuse, racism, the things that we're studying in social science, there is never one thing that's influencing an outcome. There's always multiple things. So in social science, we're never going to have complete causation, and that's okay. Exceptional cases. Again, we're always going to have exceptional cases that don't fit the pattern. So, there's been found to be a relationship between parental attachment and crime. Kids that are more attached to their parents, who, feel like they can talk to their parents, who, are supervised with their parents, hang out with their parents, eat dinner as a family, are the kids that are less likely to be involved in delinquency. However, there's always those kids that, their parents did a fantastic job raising them. They tried their hardest. They, did everything they could for them, but, the kid just went on and started acting delinquent. There's always going to be those people. So exceptional cases are okay as well, because nothing's always going to be perfect when we're looking at human behavior. Even, if something doesn't fit the majority of cases, we can still say that, there could be causality there. So again, I'm going to use supervision and juvenile delinquency. Kids that are not supervised well by their parents are more likely to be involved in delinquency. However, most kids that aren't well supervised, they tend to do okay. Maybe they don't get involved in delinquency. They have other things to do. They have after-school activities. Meaning that the majority of kids that are not supervised, in the after-school hours when their parents are working, are not going to become hardened criminals as adults. And this, still fits. Even though a majority of cases turn out okay, we could say there still might be causality there between supervision and delinquency. Okay, so next, necessary and sufficient causes. So a necessary cause is a condition that must be present for the effect to follow. And a sufficient cause represents a condition that, if present, guarantees the effect in question. The best outcomes in research include both necessary and sufficient causes. So for example, a necessary cause. Being female is a necessary cause of being pregnant. So if you're not a biological female, you can't get pregnant. If you were born a biological male, you're not going to be pregnant. Sufficient cause, again, is something that might have happened to make the effect take place, but it's not the only reason that this could happen. So for example, not taking an exam is a sufficient cause of failing. So just because you failed an exam does not mean that you didn't take it. You could have, taken the exam and didn't study. Maybe you answered randomly. Maybe you took the exam but only took like a couple questions. So again, just because you failed the exam doesn't mean you didn't take it. There's multiple ways of failing an exam. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is units of analysis. And this is very important both for the tests and your final project. Students tend to have trouble with this, trouble identifying the unit of analysis, which is okay. It takes a little bit of practice. Like I said in a previous lecture, I didn't get independent and dependent variables until I was well into grad school. So don't feel bad if you're not getting this right away. It just takes a lot of practice to be able to identify the unit of analysis. Okay, so unit of analysis, this is what or who you are examining, interviewing, and observing. So a lot of the times in social science research, we are looking at the individual. So this could be students, voters, parents, children, Catholics, anyone that we're looking at the individual. If we're giving somebody a survey, that's a really good indication that it's probably going to be the individual. Asking somebody their thoughts and feelings on that, that's again a really good, if we're interviewing someone, again, it's a good clue that we're probably looking at an individual unit of analysis. So the next are groups. So this could be families, gangs, married couples, friendship groups. So maybe, a survey would, ask people, well, how many times a week does your family have dinner together? Would be looking at, the family, using a survey that's looking at the family of the unit of analysis. And they'll say, 20% of families have dinner every single night together. 50% of families have dinner together 3 times a week. So again, gangs, looking at, maybe like a juvenile gang, just small, like groups of people. That again is a unit of analysis. That one's not as common as individuals. We do get social research that looks at this, but I'd say the most common unit of analysis for social research is definitely the individual. It could be areas, so cities, countries, neighborhoods. So a lot of research that looks at crime rates looks at areas. So generally when you see the term rate, it's going to be over a specific area, whether that be cities, countries, counties, neighborhoods, whatever. Organizations. So this is also a common unit of analysis in social science, specifically for schools. Schools fits in here. Corporations. It might ask, look at a bunch of different corporations and say, okay, which one has, more misconduct, and look at the relationship or differences between corporations instead of individuals. Could be social organizations, colleges, churches, etc. Social interactions. So this is tricky. You might think that you're looking at the individual, but really you're looking at a sort of social interaction. Not super common in social research, but we still, get it sometimes. This could be maybe, posts in an online chat room, maybe telephone calls. Again, we don't use this super often. And then a social artifact. So this is something that we do use quite often in social science. If you see anything that's looking at the differences in tweets or books or songs, you could think that it's a social artifact or any product that's produced by humans. Again, if your research question is looking at, for example, posts on Reddit that look at incel behavior, your unit of analysis is not going to be the individual there. It's going to be the post on Reddit, because we're not even really sure what individual is behind all that stuff. So again, any product that's produced by humans can be a unit of analysis as well, and we call this a social artifact. Okay, so there's some faulty reasoning about units of analysis. The first is the ecological fallacy. So this is where units of analysis become really important when we're talking about social research. This is a concept that's a little bit tricky to get, so I'm going to try to explain it the best I can, but if you don't get it, maybe do a little research of your own to figure out what this means. So this is when you're erroneously drawing conclusions about individuals solely from the observations of groups. So we could also use solely from the observations of geographical areas as well. Let's say if you say, okay, Lubbock has really bad drivers. The city of Lubbock is full of bad drivers. This does not mean that every single person in Lubbock is a bad driver. Lisa, who lives in Lubbock, doesn't mean she's a bad driver just because she lives in a city that, has bad drivers in it. Another example, there's a lot of crime in the northeast part of Lubbock. Therefore, the people or the individuals living there must be criminals. Again, we're making an erroneous assumption about the people living in a specific area that has a higher crime rate. Doesn't mean that everybody that lives in that northeast part of Lubbock is a criminal. These criminals might be coming from different areas as well. So again, when you're applying things that you're learning about a group or an area to the individuals that live there or belong to that group, that is committing an ecological fallacy. I hope that I explained that well. Okay, another error that we can make is reductionism. So this is a strict limitation or reduction of the kinds of concepts to be considered relevant to the phenomenon under study. So basically this is saying because, one thing is there, that will make it what it is. An example, saying that the Chiefs will win the Super Bowl because Mahomes is the quarterback. Well, that's a good prediction, I guess. But it doesn't matter if, you have a great quarterback and everybody else is on the team is terrible. So your team is more than just your quarterback. So again, we have to, think about everything here when we're thinking about what's going to happen. If we have terrible defense, if we have no running backs, we're probably not going to win the Super Bowl just because we have a really good quarterback. So reducing an entire group or entire area to one thing or one person is making an error of reductionism. Okay, so last thing we're going to talk about is the time dimension. Very important when you're, reading social research. You will not have time to do a longitudinal study. Longitudinal studies are very difficult to do. You'll, see in a second when we talk about them. So you will be doing a cross-sectional study for your project, which is totally fine. Cross-sectional research has a place as well. So these cross-sectional studies is based on observations representing a single point in time. So a cross-section of a population. This basically means is you're taking your observations one time. So if you're handing out a survey for people to fill out, you're getting them to fill out the survey, you're getting it back, and that's that. An example, again, a single census year. You can't time order the variables. You can't make causal claims. Although sometimes, cross-sectional studies sort of can. They can say, okay, in 2023, were you a victim of crime at all? And then in 2024, maybe did you have financial problems? So there's a way of sort of faking a longitudinal study using cross-sectional data, but generally cross-sectional data, we can't, time order the variables. So these studies are a lot cheaper, faster, and easier to do. You don't have to follow up with people to get them to, take a second survey, which is sometimes very, very difficult. But they're not, they're useful, but not as good as a longitudinal study. So the longitudinal study involves collecting of data at different points in time. So this obviously is going to take a much, much longer time. If you wanted to give people a survey once a year over the next 5 years, that's going to be a very difficult study to do. But that would be a good example of a longitudinal study where you're, collecting data at different points in time. There's several different types of longitudinal studies. So a trend study is a study in which a given characteristic of some population is monitored over time. So crime rates, that's a good one. We're not, following the same people over time and seeing if they're committing crime. We're just, calculating the number of crimes that's happening, say in Lubbock every single year, and seeing if, crime rates are going up and down. It doesn't mean that we're trying to figure out if the same people committing these crimes. We just want to see how much crime is happening. This is the sort of easiest type of longitudinal study to do. The next is a cohort study. So a study in which some specific subpopulation or cohort is studied over time. So for example, maybe we want to follow up with people born in 2002. So maybe, we're going to interview some people that are born that year, and then 5 years later, interview some other people. Again, they don't have to be the same people, but they all have to be born in 2002. So a little bit more difficult than the trend study, but easier than the panel study. So panel study, this is the most difficult type of longitudinal study to do, but there's certain questions that we have, lots of different questions in social research that require a panel study. So a panel study is a study in which data are collected from the same set of people at several points in time. So when I was in grad school, I worked on a grant-funded study with some professors following a group of men who were released from prison in a certain year. I don't remember what year it was. So what they did is they interviewed them, before they got out, and then 3 months after they got out, 6 months and 9 months or something along those lines. It was very difficult to do because it's hard to keep track of people. So lots of people tend to drop out of these studies. We call this attrition. We'll talk about that in a future chapter. But this is by far the most difficult kind of study to do when we're looking at the time dimension. Okay, again, cross-sectional is just a snapshot of time. Measurements across time, we use trend, cohort, and panel. Follow the same age group, that's a cohort study. And then finally, the exact same people are a panel study. Okay, so attrition, again, dropping out of the panel study. I thought it was in a different chapter, but I guess we'll talk about it now. Attrition is very, very, very common when you're doing a panel study. I don't know of any panel study who had the same number of people that they started with complete every interview. People die. People, you lose track of people. People become disinterested. They might do the first 2 surveys and be like, well, that was a waste of my time. I'm not going to do that again. So attrition is very, very, very common and is something that, researchers have to deal with because there's probably a difference in people that drop out of a study than the ones that stay in the study. So when we're looking at people involved in offending, it's usually the worst, the offenders that are the worst of the worst are the ones that are dropping out, either because they died, because they're back in prison, just can't keep track of them, don't want to be found, maybe they're running from the law. So again, attrition is very, very common. Okay, so while longitudinal studies are, the gold standard, we can draw approximate conclusions about longitudinal processes even when cross-sectional data are available. So for example, implying processes over time, like I said, a few minutes ago, maybe you want to ask someone, did this happen to you in 2023? And then saying, well, in the past 2 weeks, have you felt this way about it? So we can kind of fake a longitudinal study using cross-sectional data, but it's, never going to be as good as having an actual longitudinal study. There's problems with, asking individuals to recall their past behavior. Again, people have bad memory. They might just not remember things properly. Maybe they say, oh yeah, I was victimized in 2023, but it turns out they were victimized in 2022. However, we call this telescoping, where something, is kind of either an important event or a traumatic event might seem more recent than it actually was. So these are, things we're going to have to deal with if we're trying to approximate a longitudinal study.